Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Jack Hagel. The state Supreme Court. In the coming years, it'll take on issues like voting districts, education funding, and possibly abortion. On Tuesday, Republicans won control of the court, flipping it from Democratic control. WRAL reporter Brian Murphy has been tracking the change, and he joins us today. Brian, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So for listeners who don't follow the court, set the scene for us, and let's start with how North Carolina seats its justices on the Supreme Court.
Well, they're elected. They're elected to 8-year terms statewide. There are no districts, so there are seats, and they're all voted on by every registered voter who casts a ballot. And several seats are up each time. It's a 7-member court. Not all 7 seats are up every term. And so this time there were 2 seats on the 7-seat Supreme Court up for election. Both of those seats were held by Democrats.
It's 4-3, right?
Right. It's a 4-3 Democratic majority. That's down from 6-1 in 2019. So it was 4-3 entering Tuesday's elections with 2 Democratic seats up. And so Republicans simply needed to win one of those seats to grab control, and they were able to win both of those seats, and now they have a 5-2 majority.
Tell us a little bit about some of the cases that the court's dealing with today, and also sort of the role of the court right now in state government.
Well, the 4-3 Democratic majority has infuriated GOP lawmakers. It's made rulings against the legislature in the long-running Leandro case, which deals with education funding. It ruled against the legislature in redistricting. It ruled against the legislature in voter ID, in felon voting cases. I mean, there's been a lot of things that have come up that have been decided along party lines on the Supreme Court, and many of those cases have gone against the legislature.
So basically, the GOP-controlled legislature passes laws that people disagree with. They take it up in the courts, and it ends up in the Supreme Court, where a Democratic majority is making decisions on it.
Right. And it's not always laws. I mean, the maps, the congressional maps, I think is the perfect example. The congressional maps were drawn by GOP lawmakers. They're not subject to a gubernatorial veto, but they were protested, and there were lawsuits filed against them. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court here in North Carolina. The Supreme Court tossed out those congressional maps and drew their own. And that's had a huge impact on the election on Tuesday. Whereas the maps that the GOP lawmakers drew may have produced 10 Republicans and 4 Democrats, the maps that were instituted by the Supreme Court produced 7 Republicans and 7 Democrats. That's a huge difference in a very tight majority in the U.S. House of Representatives. And so issue after issue like that has come before the court, and many times the Democratic-controlled court has ruled against the GOP-controlled legislature.
And so on Tuesday, that changed. You've now got a strong control by the GOP. So what can we expect from a Republican-leaning court?
Well, on Tuesday, Richard Dietz, who's a Court of Appeals judge, defeated Lucy Inman, who's also a Court of Appeals judge, in a race to replace Democratic Justice Robin Hudson. And Trey Allen, who's the general counsel for the state court system, defeated Associate Justice Sam Ervin, a Democrat who'd been serving on the Supreme Court. And those are the 2 seats that flipped. So now it's 5-2, in favor of the Republicans. And I've heard from people on both sides who say the ramifications are substantial. We just went through a litany of cases that have been decided by the Supreme Court, usually against the GOP legislature. And now either those cases won't exist, or the GOP legislature is likely to win them. And so I think we're going to see a sea change. You know, Governor Cooper has used the veto to stop a lot of legislation, but Democrats have also used the court to argue against changes or laws that they didn't like. That option is now probably gone for Democrats at the state level.
And this isn't just one election cycle.
Right. You know, the state legislature, every seat in the state legislature is up every 2 years. That's not the way it works on the Supreme Court. They are elected to 8-year terms, the justices. And so because Republicans have won 5 seats, which is enough for a majority, in the last 2 elections, their majority is going to last through at least 2028. As I had one source tell me, this is not the next presidential election, but the next presidential election. So we're talking about 2028 at least, until there's a chance for Democrats to break the Republican majority on the Supreme Court. And you kind of never know what's going to come up. There was a international pandemic, a global pandemic, which brought lots of cases to the Supreme Court about the governor's ability to issue executive orders, the governor's ability to shut down businesses. We don't know what issues are going to come up in the next 6 years, but we do know that the body deciding those issues is going to be a Republican majority in the Supreme Court. We do know that they're going to have a lot of deference to the General Assembly. So we don't know the exact issues, but having control of the court for that long is certainly going to make an impact in the state.
Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk about how this change could affect North Carolinians in the short term and also how the GOP won these seats. Welcome back to the WRAL Daily Download. We're talking with WRAL reporter Brian Murphy about the state Supreme Court, which was flipped to Republican control in Tuesday's elections. Brian, we may not be able to see what a GOP-controlled Supreme Court might do 5 years from now, but what kind of impact might it have in the short term?
I think the biggest impact or the first impact we're going to see is dealing with redistricting. The congressional map that was put into place by the previous Supreme Court, the Democratic-controlled Supreme Court, is only good for the 2022 election. GOP lawmakers, the GOP majority in both the House and the Senate, are going to redraw those maps. Not this year. We found out that they're not going to do it this year, but early next year, you would think they will get around to redrawing those maps. And right now, it's 7 Republicans and 7 Democrats. I can guarantee you those maps are not going to be 7-7 maps in 2024. They're likely to be 10-4 maps, possibly 11-3 maps, but Jeff Jackson, Wiley Nickel, 2 Democrats who were just elected to the U.S. House, can fully expect that their districts will not look the same. Kathy Manning, who represents a Greensboro area district, her district did not exist in the first version of these maps that was passed by the GOP legislature. I think that's the first area we're going to see the court's impact. There's no one for Democratic activists or Democratic operatives or the Democratic Party to appeal these districts to. You can appeal them up to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court, if you read the minority opinions given by the justices that are still on the court, have expressed a deference to the General Assembly on cases like this. The U.S. Supreme Court's already said, we don't deal with partisan gerrymandering, and the Supreme Court has the previous minority on the Supreme Court has basically said, we shouldn't deal with it either. This is the legislature's prerogative. And so I think that's the first area of impact. I think, certainly Democrats have made a big deal about abortion. And it's possible that the state legislature decides to curtail abortion rights in the state. That would normally get appealed up to the Supreme Court. You would imagine Democrats and liberals would want the court to weigh in on that. Maybe they don't. Maybe they don't appeal it to the Supreme Court because they're likely to get an unfavorable ruling, and that ruling then becomes precedent that future courts can use. And so I think one of the things that we may see out of the right-leaning court is there's just less litigation. Liberal groups are unwilling to push stuff up that they think they're going to lose, unwilling to allow the Supreme Court to set precedent. And Republican or conservative groups have no reason to send stuff up to the Supreme Court. And so that may be one of the short-term effects, less litigation, we see making it up to the high court.
I'm almost wondering if we could also see more cases appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Yeah, but on some of the biggest issues that the Supreme Court may face, they've already weighed in. They've already weighed in on abortion. They're not going to take another abortion case, it wouldn't seem. They've already weighed in on partisan gerrymandering and said that's not something for us to decide. That's something for the state courts to decide. And so in some cases, the North Carolina Supreme Court is the last word unless you decide to take it up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And there's no guarantee with a conservative majority on the U.S. Supreme Court that you'd be able to get cases to the Supreme Court and get a favorable ruling there either. And so it will make for some interesting decisions by Democrats and liberal activists as to what path they choose. Do they choose to fight a lot of these things in court, which has been something that they've done a lot of, or do they decide to, hey, let's try to win back the legislature or try to at least break a supermajority and allow perhaps a Democratic governor to veto some of this stuff? That may be a better use of their time and resources than failing in court time and time again.
How were Republicans able to win these seats? What did they do from a political strategy standpoint?
Yeah, it's been a long process. I mean, we've seen at the federal level how conservatives have worked for years to turn the Supreme Court. And they were finally able to do it. And now you're starting to see some of the results of that. It's been likewise a long time coming for Republicans at the state level. Back in 2016, 2018, partisan identification was added to the ballot. And so that, voters knew if the justice they were electing was a Republican or a Democrat. Previously, Democrats had removed partisan labels from the ballot. Prior to that, there were partisan labels. So it's kind of gone back and forth depending on what the party in power thought was best for their electoral opportunities. What you've seen over the last two cycles is more money flowing into these races, a higher profile to these races. Republicans have won 5 seats in the last 2 years, in the last 2 election cycles. They've also won 9 appellate court seats in that time. So we're talking the 2020 election, the 2022 election. They're 9-0 in appellate court races. They're 5-0 in Supreme Court races. They have made this a high priority from the strategy level. The party has really gotten behind whoever wins the nomination. They have sort of placed an outsized importance on these, and in part because the state lawmakers are so frustrated. They passed voter ID in a constitutional amendment. The court overturned it. They thought they had gotten the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, to rule in their favor on partisan gerrymandering, and the state Supreme Court overturned it. They've been very frustrated that they have not been able to get their way on a lot of these issues, and they know that the court has been an impediment to that. And so they've worked really hard to flip these seats, to win these races, and now North Carolina is going to have a Republican majority for a long time on the Supreme Court.
Well, we'll be watching to see how it unfolds. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks for having me.
That's WRAL reporter Brian Murphy. For his recent election coverage on the state Supreme Court and the legislature, visit the NC Capital section of WRAL.com. Thanks for listening to the WRAL Daily Download. You can also listen to entire WRAL newscasts in podcast form. Find WRAL newscasts in your podcast app. The feed is updated with new newscasts multiple times per day.